A black billionaire heard a knock at midnight and opened the door to the past she thought she had buried. Two boys stood in the rain, silent, holding proof that during the early days of her company, someone took the fall for a decision she approved. They didn't come for money. They came for the truth. And if the truth came out, she could lose everything she built. At exactly 20:17 a.m., a knock echoed through the mansion of billionaire Aurora Ellison, not loud, not frantic, but deliberate, as if the person outside understood that sound carried differently in a house built on silence. The estate sat elevated above the quiet Atlanta neighborhood, its stone facade washed in soft architectural lighting, its gates monitored by layered security systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of interruption. Nothing reached Aurora's front door without clearance. Nothing unexpected crossed her threshold. Aurora Ellison, 43, had built her fortune in private equity and renewable infrastructure, turning distressed energy assets into billion-dollar transformations. She was known in financial circles for precision and restraint. She did not gamble, she calculated. Her success had been engineered through discipline so strict it bordered on ritual. Her mornings began at 5, her meetings were timed to the minute, and her personal life existed only as a footnote beneath corporate strategy. There were no family portraits in the mansion's marble hallway, no late-night guests, no spontaneous celebrations. Wealth had expanded her space but narrowed her circle. The knock came again, steady and controlled. Outside, the storm that had passed earlier left a residue of damp air and reflective pavement. The neighborhood was silent, security patrols already completed for the night. Aurora paused at the base of the grand staircase, irritation flickering first. Interruption suggested inefficiency. Inefficiency suggested vulnerability. She glanced toward the wall monitor displaying live feeds from perimeter cameras. The front gate remained locked. No breach alerts appeared. Yet someone stood at her door. She contacted security through the internal system. No visitor had been scheduled. No deliveries were pending. Access logs showed no override. The anomaly unsettled her more than the knock itself. Aurora moved toward the monitor and switched to the porch camera feed. The screen illuminated two figures beneath the warm exterior light. Two young black boys stood on the stone steps, soaked from residual rain, their clothes darkened by water. They were not pounding on the door. They were not attempting to shelter beneath the overhang. They simply stood there, composed and silent. The older one appeared around 15, shoulders squared despite damp fabric clinging to his frame. The younger, perhaps 9, remained half a step behind him, observant and still. The contrast between the dry, gleaming marble inside and the wet pavement outside felt almost staged. Aurora studied their posture. There was no panic in their stance, no recklessness. Only intention. Curiosity displaced irritation. Then unease followed quietly behind it. How had they bypassed the gate without triggering an alarm? Or had someone granted them entry without authorization? Security requested instruction to remove them immediately. Protocol required it. Aurora hesitated longer than necessary. Something about the older boy's expression held her attention. It was not desperation. It was expectation. After a measured pause, she ordered security to stand down and remain at distance. The decision surprised even her. She walked toward the front door herself, heels echoing softly against polished stone. As she disengaged the lock and pulled the door open, cool damp air entered the foyer. The older boy lifted his gaze without flinching. In his hand, he held a sealed envelope, slightly creased at the edges from rain. Her full name written across it in handwriting Aurora had not seen in 15 years. They did not ask for help. They did not explain themselves. They only handed her the envelope and stood there, as if the night itself had paused to witness what she would do next. The older boy extended it carefully, not with hesitation but with intention. Water dripped from his sleeve onto the stone porch, yet his grip remained steady. His name, Aurora would soon learn, was Darius Holloway. 15 years old, tall for his age, with the composed restraint of someone who had learned early that emotion could be used against him. Beside him stood Micah Holloway, 9, smaller and visibly exhausted but alert. His eyes moved between Aurora's face and the open doorway behind her, taking in the marble floors, the chandelier light, the quiet opulence. Unlike his brother, Micah's emotions were easier to read. There was curiosity there, and something softer, perhaps uncertainty, but no fear. Neither boy appeared reckless. Their soaked sneakers and darkened jeans suggested they had walked a considerable distance through the damp midnight streets to arrive here. Aurora's gaze shifted to the envelope. She recognized the handwriting before she consciously admitted it. The slant of the letters, the careful spacing, the firm downward strokes at the end of each word. Lorraine Holloway. The recognition did not arrive gently. It surfaced like something long submerged. Lorraine had worked in Aurora's first startup office nearly 15 years earlier, during the fragile phase when investors doubted projections and payroll deadlines felt like countdown clocks. Lorraine had managed scheduling, internal files, and early compliance documentation. She had been efficient and discreet, rarely drawing attention to herself. Then, during the company's most precarious financial crisis, she had left abruptly. The explanation at the time had been simple: personal reasons. Aurora had not pressed further. Survival had demanded forward motion. Rainwater gathered along the edges of the porch. Aurora stepped aside slightly, offering shelter from the lingering mist. The boys did not move. Pride held them in place. Their presence was not a request for comfort. It was a delivery. Suspicion rose first within Aurora. Why now? Why at midnight? Why after so many years? Yet recognition pressed against that suspicion, forcing her to confront a past she had categorized as closed. She broke the seal of the envelope carefully, aware of Darius watching her with unwavering focus. The first line of the letter shifted her posture almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders, usually squared with practiced authority, lowered a fraction. The words referenced a financial filing during the company's survival phase, a document Aurora remembered signing under intense pressure from early partners. Lorraine's handwriting suggested that the document did not reflect the full truth of what had occurred. Aurora read silently, the porch light casting shadows across the page. Micah's gaze flickered between her face and his brother's still form. Darius remained composed, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind repeatedly. When Aurora reached the final line, the night felt heavier. Lorraine had written that she never told Aurora everything about what happened during those crisis months, believing silence would protect the company. Now, the letter explained, there was no opportunity to clarify it in person. Lorraine was gone, and whatever truth she carried had been passed forward instead, long before Aurora Ellison became a symbol of financial precision and billion-dollar leverage. She was a founder on the brink of collapse. In the early years of her company, the office had been smaller than the boardroom she now commanded and far less certain. Investors questioned projections. Credit lines tightened without warning. Payroll deadlines felt like quiet threats circling every Friday. Those months were defined not by confidence, but by urgency. Survival was the only metric that mattered. Lorraine Holloway had been the office manager during that period, responsible for internal accounts, compliance filings, and documentation that kept regulators satisfied while Aurora fought to keep capital flowing. Lorraine was organized and steady, rarely emotional, the kind of employee who absorbed pressure without complaint. When financial instability intensified, discrepancies began surfacing within expense reports and vendor accounts. The irregularities were subtle, buried in complexity, but they raised alarms among early partners who were already uneasy about liquidity. Under mounting pressure, Aurora approved emergency restructuring measures. Contracts were terminated, departments consolidated, and liability exposure minimized wherever possible. Legal advisors recommended swift action to reassure investors. Aurora signed off on those measures with little time for reflection. In that season, hesitation felt like surrender. She believed that decisiveness, even if painful, was leadership. Lorraine resigned shortly after the restructuring concluded. At the time, Aurora accepted the departure as collateral damage of rapid transition. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no visible resentment, only an email citing personal circumstances. Aurora moved forward without revisiting the details. Survival demanded momentum, not retrospection. Now, under the porch light with rain still glistening across the stone steps, Aurora reread Lorraine's letter more carefully. The tone was not accusatory. It was restrained, almost protective. Lorraine suggested that during the financial discrepancy investigation, responsibility had been redirected. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. She had taken blame for irregularities she did not create. The restructuring filings Aurora authorized may have relied on incomplete or manipulated internal reports. A quiet suspicion formed. During those desperate months, had early executives shielded themselves by isolating liability within someone expendable. Had Aurora's urgency been used against her, her trust in advisors leveraged to close the crisis quickly. She had believed survival justified emotional detachment. If sacrifices were necessary, she convinced herself they were strategic. Now that belief felt fragile. Darius stood silently as Aurora processed the letter. His expression held expectation rather than anger. He was not here to accuse her publicly. He was waiting to see whether she would recognize what the letter implied. Micah remained still, absorbing tension that neither adult voiced aloud. The silence between them carried more weight than confrontation would have. Aurora turned the page and noticed additional papers folded within the envelope. Financial documents, photocopied and annotated in Lorraine's handwriting, detailed filings from the crisis period. As Aurora scanned the signatures at the bottom of the page, a chill replaced the damp night air. The authorization forms bore her name, not digitally processed but signed on transactions and liability transfers she did not remember approving. It was her signature but not her decision. The ink was unmistakable. The looping precision of Aurora Ellison's name placed neatly at the bottom of compliance filings dated 15 years earlier. Yet as she studied the documents under the foyer light, she could not recall authorizing the specific asset transfers detailed within them. The papers outlined emergency reallocations during the company's crisis period, shielding senior executives and primary investors from exposure while assigning operational liability elsewhere. That elsewhere, she now realized, was Lorraine Holloway. The documents showed Lorraine listed as the responsible compliance officer in filings connected to a financial discrepancy investigation. Language within the forms suggested oversight failure and internal mismanagement, but the structure of the liability transfer shifted legal consequences downward. If regulators had pursued penalties at that time, the burden would have fallen on her. Aurora felt the quiet precision of it all. This was not chaos. It was calculated insulation. She moved toward her study, instructing security to escort the boys inside out of the damp air. Without ceremony, she accessed archived corporate records through encrypted databases she rarely revisited. The early years were preserved digitally: contracts, restructuring plans, partner communications. As she cross-referenced timestamps, she noticed a pattern. Certain compliance drafts had been routed through a single executive before reaching her for signature. Victor Langford. Victor had been an early-stage partner, charismatic and persuasive, responsible for investor relations during the company's formative months. He exited quietly a few years after stabilization, citing strategic divergence. At the time, Aurora had viewed his departure as routine evolution. Now, reviewing metadata trails and revision histories, she saw his involvement more clearly. He had controlled the narrative flow during the crisis, presenting summarized options framed as necessary survival tactics. In desperation, she had trusted his clarity. Darius remained silent but observant as Aurora worked. The letter's later pages described Lorraine's life after resignation. Financial penalties followed, tied to the compliance filing that bore her name. Personal credit suffered. Insurance complications intensified when health issues emerged years later. Lorraine had absorbed consequences without contesting them publicly, believing exposure might collapse the fragile company she once helped build. Her silence, according to the letter, was intentional. Aurora felt something fracture beneath her composure. For years, she had credited her success to discipline and resilience. Now she confronted the possibility that part of her ascent had been stabilized by misinformation she never challenged. Survival, she once believed, justified streamlined decisions. But streamlined did not mean truthful. The broader implications settled heavily. If these documents resurfaced publicly, early investors who still maintained influence in financial circles could face scrutiny. Media narratives would not distinguish between manipulated summaries and intentional misconduct. Reputation, once questioned, rarely regained its original clarity. As Aurora continued scanning corporate acquisition updates, another detail surfaced that tightened the atmosphere further. Victor Langford was currently positioned to acquire a major renewable infrastructure division from her company, a deal nearing final approval. The man who may have engineered the liability shield during her most vulnerable phase was now preparing to profit from her success once again. To correct the past, she might have to dismantle the present. The realization settled into Aurora Ellison's thoughts with the same precision she once applied to balance sheets. By morning, she had already contacted an independent forensic accounting firm, instructing them to conduct a confidential audit into the company's earliest crisis period filings. The directive was framed as internal compliance review, but its implications were far larger. Reopening documents from 15 years ago risked more than embarrassment. It invited scrutiny. Resistance surfaced quickly within the board. Senior members questioned the necessity of revisiting a resolved financial era, warning that federal regulators could interpret renewed audits as admission of concealed misconduct. The company's current valuation depended on stability, and stability required confidence. Aurora listened without defensiveness, but she did not retract the order. She understood the stakes. Transparency could destabilize stock prices, delay pending acquisitions, and expose early investors who still maintained influence in political and financial networks. Word traveled faster than anticipated. Victor Langford became aware of the inquiry before the audit officially began. His name appeared in preliminary file retrieval logs, triggering quiet alerts among those who remembered the survival years. Within days, financial journalists began publishing speculative pieces about legacy compliance reviews inside Aurora's firm. The coverage was subtle, framed as curiosity rather than accusation, but the timing was pointed. Markets respond to perception as quickly as to fact. Inside the estate, the atmosphere remained restrained. Darius maintained his measured composure, watching developments without visible relief. He had not brought the letter to provoke spectacle. He wanted acknowledgement, not charity, not sympathy. He observed Aurora's actions carefully, gauging whether they signaled genuine accountability or strategic containment. His caution was discipline shaped by experience rather than distrust alone. Micah, by contrast, sensed intention before outcome. He noticed the late hours Aurora spent reviewing files, the absence of dismissiveness in her posture, the quiet seriousness replacing irritation. Without words, a subtle trust began forming in him. It was not based on wealth or authority, but on attention. Aurora reviewed projections outlining potential financial exposure. If liability transfers were proven manipulated, restitution claims could extend beyond Lorraine's case. Early investors might face investigation. Civil suits could emerge. The numbers reached into the billions. For years, she had protected the company's future by minimizing past vulnerabilities. Now she understood that Lorraine Holloway had absorbed blame that shielded not just executives, but founders, including herself. The emotional tension sharpened into a singular question: preserve legal safety or pursue moral repair? Success had insulated her from revisiting the survival years too closely. Now the insulation felt complicit. Late one evening, a private communication arrived through legal channels. Victor Langford requested a confidential conversation. The message was concise but unmistakable in tone. If Aurora continued reopening historical filings, he implied, information from the company's early expansion phase could surface publicly, information that would complicate her narrative of ignorance. The warning was not aggressive, but it was calculated. Aurora understood immediately. Correcting Lorraine's story might cost more than money. It might cost the version of herself the world believed in. Not all wars are loud. Some are fought in paperwork and silence. Aurora Ellison understood that the moment she declined Victor Langford's private request for discretion, she did not respond emotionally, nor did she negotiate. Instead, she expanded the scope of the independent forensic audit, granting investigators unrestricted access to archived financial records, internal communications, and compliance drafts from the company's earliest years. If the truth threatened her position, she would face it directly rather than manage it quietly. Victor's response was strategic. Within days, selective fragments of old correspondence began surfacing through financial media outlets. The excerpts suggested Aurora had been present in meetings where restructuring decisions were discussed in greater detail than she had publicly acknowledged. The context was incomplete, but the implication was clear. She may have known more than she claimed. Markets reacted predictably. Stock volatility intensified. Analysts questioned whether the company's leadership was stable under mounting scrutiny. Inside boardrooms, tension sharpened. Several members raised concerns about prolonged instability, arguing that transparency without containment risked shareholder erosion. Leadership continuity, they insisted, was critical in moments of uncertainty. Aurora listened carefully, but she refused to retreat. The audit would proceed without interference. She had spent her career mastering controlled environments. Now she faced the discomfort of surrendering that control to independent scrutiny. Darius observed her carefully as news coverage escalated. At first, he had expected defensive maneuvering or strategic silence. Instead, he witnessed steady resolve. Aurora did not deflect responsibility, nor did she publicly accuse Victor without documented proof. She allowed investigators to speak through evidence. The measured consistency began shifting Darius's perception. Respect, cautious but genuine, replaced the skepticism he carried when he first arrived at her door. Late at night, alone in her study, Aurora reflected on her childhood in a cramped apartment where unpaid bills shaped daily anxiety. She had vowed never to feel powerless again. Control became her shield against instability. If she managed every variable, nothing could collapse unexpectedly. That belief had propelled her upward. Yet now she recognized its flaw. Control preserved image, it did not guarantee integrity. In protecting the company from scrutiny years ago, she may have protected a narrative rather than the truth. The audit findings began arriving in structured reports. Metadata trails confirmed document revisions prior to final signatures. Internal messages revealed coordinated instructions directing compliance responsibility toward Lorraine Holloway during the crisis period. The language was deliberate, framing the liability shift as operational necessity. Aurora's signature appeared only after those revisions were finalized, embedded within summaries that concealed the structural redirection. The evidence no longer suggested confusion or oversight. It confirmed intention. Lorraine had not merely absorbed blame, she had been positioned deliberately as a liability shield under executive instruction. And as Aurora read the final verification memo, she understood that the battle had moved beyond reputation. It had become a reckoning that would demand consequences far greater than market volatility. Legacy is not what you protect, it is what you are willing to risk. Aurora Ellison understood that truth more clearly than ever as the finalized audit report rested on her desk. The findings left little room for strategic ambiguity. Lorraine Holloway had been deliberately positioned as a liability buffer during the company's most vulnerable phase, shielding senior partners and preserving investor confidence. Aurora's signature, though not born of malice, had validated the maneuver. The past could no longer remain archived. She scheduled a press conference without consulting the board's communications team. The statement she delivered was precise and unembellished. She acknowledged structural manipulation within the company's early compliance filings and confirmed that an internal investigation had verified executive misconduct. She did not dilute responsibility by hiding behind technical language. The disclosure reverberated through financial markets within minutes. Stock values dropped sharply, reflecting investor anxiety rather than legal certainty. Simultaneously, legal action was initiated against Victor Langford and others implicated in orchestrating the liability transfer. The filing outlined documentary evidence and revision histories that demonstrated intentional redirection of responsibility. Victor's public response was measured but defensive, signaling a battle that would unfold through courts rather than headlines. Inside the boardroom, urgency escalated. Emergency sessions were convened, and a formal vote to remove Aurora as chief executive officer was introduced under the premise of protecting shareholder interests. Several members argued that leadership change was necessary to restore market confidence. Aurora did not contest the debate. She had already calculated the trajectory. Before the vote could conclude, she announced her voluntary resignation as CEO, effective immediately upon transition planning. The decision reframed the narrative. Rather than being forced out, she relinquished authority to stabilize the company while ensuring reform policies were contractually embedded. The restitution framework she established would operate independently of leadership changes, funded by executive equity holdings. Lorraine Holloway's legal record was formally cleared through coordinated filings, restoring her name within regulatory databases that once reflected compliance fault. Darius received the acknowledgement with quiet composure. It was not framed as charity or benevolence. It was correction. The distinction mattered deeply. For the first time, his presence at Aurora's door felt less like intrusion and more like catalyst. Micah observed the transformation with unfiltered clarity. He had arrived at the mansion witnessing power from a distance. Now he watched it surrender position for principle. On her final evening in the executive office she had occupied for over a decade, Aurora stood before the floor. To ceiling windows overlooking the city she helped power. The skyline shimmered as it always had, indifferent to leadership titles. She felt neither defeated nor triumphant, only aligned. As she gathered personal belongings from her desk, a message arrived from the forensic team reviewing Lorraine's extended records. Newly uncovered information about Lorraine's final months suggested her silence had not been motivated solely by protection of the company. There was another reason she never disclosed, one that would alter Aurora's understanding of the entire story. The knock at midnight was never about money. It was about truth arriving when silence expires. Months after that night, the consequences continued unfolding with steady inevitability. Legal proceedings against Victor Langford advanced through federal courts, supported by forensic documentation that traced deliberate compliance manipulation during the company's earliest financial crisis. The case was no longer speculative, it was procedural. Depositions, archived correspondence, and metadata trails replaced rumor with evidence. Within the corporation Aurora once led, reforms were not symbolic. Independent compliance oversight became permanent policy. Executive liability protections were restructured to prevent unilateral shielding during future crises. Investors who had initially resisted scrutiny gradually recognized that transparency restored credibility more sustainably than concealment ever could. The volatility that once threatened collapse stabilized into recalibrated confidence. Lorraine Holloway's name was formally cleared across regulatory records. The compliance filing that once marked her as responsible party was amended publicly, correcting the narrative that had followed her for years. Though she was no longer present to witness it, the correction restored dignity to her memory. That restoration carried weight beyond documentation. It altered the legacy her sons would inherit. Darius moved forward with deliberate focus. Through academic merit and competitive evaluation, he earned a national scholarship that recognized his performance rather than his circumstances. The distinction mattered deeply to him. He did not want to be known as a beneficiary of corporate guilt. He wanted acknowledgement rooted in capability. Micah returned to a stable school environment, no longer shifting between districts or housing uncertainty. Stability softened the guarded tension that once defined his posture. Aurora transitioned into a new phase of leadership, no longer anchored to a corporate title but to principle. She directed her investment portfolio toward accountability, driven initiatives prioritizing governance frameworks that required transparency at foundational levels. The shift was not dramatic, it was intentional. She understood now that success measured solely by valuation was incomplete. One autumn afternoon, the gates of her estate remained open throughout a community economic reform forum hosted on the property grounds. Entrepreneurs, policy advocates, and families walked freely across spaces once defined by exclusivity. Aurora stood near the entrance, observing rather than commanding. The image was subtle but significant. The barrier that once separated silence from consequence had changed form. As evening approached and the gathering dispersed, Aurora remained briefly at the threshold where months earlier 2 boys had stood in the rain. She understood that her empire had survived exposure, but it had not remained unchanged. Success without truth, she realized, was structurally fragile, and as the quiet settled once again over the estate, a final question lingered beyond wealth and reputation. If someone knocked on your door at midnight with proof that your success had harmed their family years ago, would you open the door or protect what you built? If stories about power, accountability, and difficult choices resonate with you, then this space is for you. This channel is not just about drama, it is about the moments that test who we really are. Stay connected for more stories that challenge success, truth, and integrity in ways that linger long after the screen fades. And if this story moved you, pass it forward to someone who values courage over comfort.